According to the news, a new study claims to be transforming diagnosis and treatment of autism. And I know that's the Daily Mail, but The Independent ran with the headline, "Major Autism Breakthrough Could Revolutionise Treatments and Care," which is pretty close to Princeton's own PR department's headline, "Major Autism Study Uncovers Biologically Distinct Subtypes, Paving the Way for Precision Diagnosis and Care." Most of the press coverage dropped in the early hours of Wednesday morning on July the 9th, as though it were hype for the launch of a new smartphone or perhaps a new Taylor Swift album drop. And curiously, Alison Singer, Autism Speaks' very first employee who later resigned from Autism Speaks due to its anti-vax policies of the time, well, she promoted science on one hand, but on the other hand, as the mother to 2 children, one of whom is autistic, considered driving off a bridge with the autistic child, but changed her mind at the last minute because of the neurotypical child who would be left behind. Wild, right?
But I remember that was a very scary moment for me when I realized I had sat in the car for about 15 minutes and actually contemplated putting Jody in the car and driving off the George Washington Bridge, and that would be preferable to having to put her in one of these schools. And it's only because of Lauren, the fact that I have another child, that I probably didn't do it.
So why am I mentioning her? Because her foundation, the Autism Science Foundation, ASF.
We also advocate for the needs of people with autism and their families and share information about autism with the broader community.
Receives direct financial support from the Simons Foundation, who funded the 2 autism subtype studies via their Autism Research Initiative, or SAFARI, which also supports Alison's work. Alison sits on the SPARC advisory board, where she influences policy and priorities, and I think at this point it's fair to say that Alison's views on autism are about as pathological as they come, saying in Science in 2023 in relation to autism that if you can't choose words like challenging behaviours or severe disorder or symptoms or comorbid disorder, then how are you supposed to study these things? In fact, she was one of the primary authors who coined the term profound autism. I made a video detailing the problems with this, and I've linked it in the description box below. Because today we're going to look at what both studies say, and yes, there have been 2 separate studies, and spoiler alert, they don't say what the headlines do. And we need to take a little trip into eugenics town to visit the mayor and their friends. Hey friends, I'm Mike, a late identified autistic adult, and today we're looking at the July 2025 paper, which was accompanied by a PR fanfare. But this paper was actually a follow-up study to one published 2 years earlier by different authors, but from the same organisations behind the scenes. By the end of this video, which I hope isn't going to be too long today, you're going to know more about the actual science and the organisations behind it than you did before. And yes, these organisations are a little unhinged, but is there anything useful here? Back in 2023, Nature Neuroscience. In 2023, researchers gathered fMRI scans from about 299 autistic people and 907 non-autistic controls. These were taken at rest. They then looked for patterns in how different brain regions sync up. They used a fancy statistical method called Regularized Canonical Correlation Analysis, or RCCA, which sounds like a spell from a wizarding school, but really it just means that it's finding hidden links between 2 seemingly unrelated sets of data. One set of data came from the fMRI brain scans, and the other set of data came from assessment of autistic behaviours. The RCCA looks for hidden links between the 2. In simple terms, the researchers asked, are there underlying brain behaviour vibes that many autistic people share? And they found 3 of these dimensions. The researchers then clustered participants using machine learning, basically grouping individuals who had similar scores on these hidden factors. The team could have stopped there and published their results, but they went further and overlaid their results with gene expression maps from the Allen Human Brain Atlas. The Brain Atlas is a project that maps which genes are active in different brain regions. By then overlaying the results from the 4 subgroups with the Human Brain Atlas, which showed alignment and consensus with the already known autism-linked gene sets. In other words, differences in brain wiring were explained, at least partly, by differences in which genes are active near to or in those brain regions. Different subtypes showed what researchers call enrichment for different biological pathways. One subgroup's pattern connected to immune-related genes, and another to synaptic function genes, and so on. And that's it. It's super interesting data, but it has its flaws and limitations that we will come to later in this video. Notably, this research was published in early 2023 in Nature, which is a respected, peer-reviewed journal, but there wasn't much kind of PR fanfare. I mean, I didn't realise they published it. No one was emailing me about it. But then, in 2025, in Nature Genetics, the 2025 study took a different route. Now, that one was more about traits and DNA than brain scans. This team, Princeton University and Simons Foundation collaborators and so on, harnessed data from over 5,000 autistic children aged between 4 to 18 in a fairly large genetic study called SPARK. Instead of brain imaging, they had an enormous spreadsheet, if you like, of behavioural data, more than 230 traits per individual, from social skills to repetitive behaviours to developmental milestones. They also used machine learning to crunch these measures into clusters to see if kids naturally group into clusters based on overall phenotype. And again, 4 subtypes emerged from the data. They looked at whether common genetic factors like polygenic scores, which is the cumulative effect of lots of tiny DNA tweaks associated with other conditions, and rare variants, they looked at those too. The bigger mutations, including de novo mutations, which appear new in the child, and inherited ones. They also analysed when the genes in each subgroup tend to act. Is it before birth or after birth? And what biological functions these genes are involved in. In research speak, they checked which gene categories or pathways were enriched in each cluster. Enriched just means overrepresented. If one's subtype members carry a bunch of mutations in, say, synapse-related genes, that subtype is called enriched for synaptic pathways. I know it sounds a little bit like enriched uranium, but let's continue. In both the 2023 and 2025 study had both got one foot in biology and the other foot in behavioural data. And both studies used AI to try to find correlations between what would be otherwise completely unmatched data sets. They're completely different things. A mess of acronyms and pathology. Both studies were supported by the Simons Foundation Autism Research Initiative, or SAFARI, under Simons Foundation Powering Autism Research for Knowledge, or SPARK datasets. Simons Foundation created the Simons Foundation Autism Research Initiative, which bankrolls the ABIDE, which is Autism Brain Imaging Data Exchange, and SPARK, which is the Simons Foundation Powering Autism Research for Knowledge. ABIDE is where the brain circuitry snapshot data came from, and SPARK is where the genotype and longitudinal phenotype data comes from. Now, according to SPARK's 2025 RFAs, this is request for applications. This is how they say, hey, we've got a certain amount of money here and we're looking to investigate this. Please give us your research proposals and then we'll pick the ones we like best and then fund them. They say the mission of the Simons Foundation Autism Research Initiative, SAFARI, is to advance the basic science of autism and related neurodevelopmental disorders. Simons Foundation also co-funds projects with Autism Speaks. For instance, Autism BrainNet, a literal, physical repository of autistic brain tissue, which Alison Singer encourages families to register their autistic child's brains for donation. She says, most people think brain tissue is included when you register as an organ donor, but it's not, says Alison Singer, president of the Autism Science Foundation. Every family raising a child with autism needs to think about registering to donate brain tissue in case of a tragedy. Brain tissue research is the best hope we have for understanding what causes autism and developing new and better treatments for individuals with autism. Let me just say, it's not the science bit that I find troubling here, but the pathologizing of autistic traits and differences. You could argue that the brains of autism moms who consider committing and vulnerable child.
I had sat in the car for about 15 minutes and actually contemplated putting Jody in the car and driving off the George Washington Bridge. And that
Driver driving off a bridge, those people should have their brain tissues donated to see what's wrong with them. You could argue that. This is where I have big problems with autism research as it currently is. And it's something that I've discussed at length in the past. People like Alison Singer and the organisations that she's connected with have a disproportionately huge influence on autism research agenda and financing. They are heavily genetics focused and have minimal, if any, autistic-led oversight or governance. Take this recruitment pamphlet for Spark, aimed at adding subjects to their data collection initiative. It's not directed at autistic adults. It's squarely aimed at the very, very many autism moms and occasionally autism dads in some twee testimonials. It's like targeting parents to enrol their children. So we find a cause for autism then. Let's just say they win in that respect. And the obsession with prenatal screening. Let's say there's a prenatal test for autism. What purpose is that for exactly? When they talk about improving lives, we're not necessarily talking about improving the lives of the autistic newborn. It's not their lives we're talking about improving, is it? Using medicalised disease language like burden, deficits, affected, is only appropriate for medical conditions, which are a problem that needs to be removed or resolved or cured, of which autism is not. As Simon's Foundation is fond of its acronyms, I've got a few suggestions for them for future projects. I mean, look, they could have targeted early screening to identify children lacking empathy signals. Or, for the early screening programs, they could use preemptive neurodivergence identification system. Or perhaps biometric observations of behaviour in early screening. Perhaps for their current round of grants, they could advertise as they're looking for funding for a brain over-observation based in eugenic science. Too far? They could even sponsor a combined study like the Penis Boobies Longitudinal Cohort Study and include some trite testimonial from grateful neurotypical parents. Okay, sorry about that. I was ranting a bit. What does the science actually say? And what are these 4 subtypes anyway? I'll use the 2025 version, which gives more handy descriptive names, like social and behavioural challenges. Now, this is about 37% of the sample. The subjects here have the classic autism profile, if you will, in terms of social interaction difficulties and repetitive behaviours, but without significant developmental delays, according to a neurotypical developmental trajectory anyway. This group often has additional mental health toppings like ADHD, anxiety, depression, OCD, and so on. This is the core autism traits, plus a grab bag of co-occurring conditions group. And it was over a third of the subjects in the study. And remember, we're only looking at kids and mostly white male ones, okay? So this isn't diagnostic. The studies don't make that claim themselves. The whole kind of diagnostic claim and over-treatment claim is entirely clickbait news headline territory. Sadly, even from Princeton University, did kind of expect better from them, since their researchers never made those claims. Mixed ASD with developmental delay. Now, this group is the mirror image of the first, sort of. These kids show notable developmental delays, so being slower to crawl, walk. I was slow to crawl and I went straight to walking eventually. Interestingly, they don't tend to have the additional psychiatric conditions like anxiety or ADHD. Now, the name here, mixed, hints that there's some variability, but some have more social challenges or more repetitive behaviours, but all share the early developmental delays. And this is about a fifth of the group. Moving on to moderate challenges. That's it. And it's a weird label, I know, moderate. If the first group was autism plus extra issues, and the second is autism plus big delays, then the third cluster is more moderate across the board. This group tended to have core autism-related difficulties, but less intense than the other groups, and they tended to reach developmental milestones on time and generally don't have co-occurring psychiatric diagnoses. This is about a third of the kids in the Spark data set. And lastly, the final group is the broadly affected group. This is about 10% and the smallest group. This is a polite way to say that these kids have a lot going on and experience the highest level of support needs with significant developmental delays and are often combined with multiple co-occurring conditions. These descriptors are from the 2025 study, but the 2023 study found a set of subtypes that kind of echo a similar theme, but two subgroups stood out for having above average verbal intelligence, but opposite autism profiles. One had what they call severe social communication deficits, but relatively fewer repetitive behaviours, and the other had the reverse, lots of repetitive behaviours, but less social impairment. The details don't really line up neatly between 2023 and 2025 studies. They did use different data and methods after all, but the broad strokes do match up. Some autistic people, kids, mostly white in this cohort, have mostly social communication struggles with fewer repetitive movements. Others the opposite. Some have relatively mild traits, their words, not mine. Others are hit from all sides with severe sensory, behavioural and cognitive challenges. Much of this data started off as a cheek swab, but these are not 4 types that you can test for with a cheek swab. These findings are not proof or even evidence that autism is somehow just a brain defect waiting to be fixed. We are not dealing with a new system of autism types that cleanly separates people like species of Pokemon. They're more like fuzzy clusters on a spectrum. An individual autistic person might not fit perfectly into one of the 4 buckets, but they might sit on the border between them or move between them from one to another as they grow, especially because things like brain connectivity can change with age. The 2025 study combined kids from ages 4 through 18 into one homogeneous group. So, that data set can contain both preschoolers and older teenagers, like nearly adults. And these 4 autism subtypes are not exhaustive or immutable, and the researchers never said that they were, by the way. The researchers expect that with larger and more diverse data sets that we might discover additional subtypes or sub-subtypes, or that the boundaries will shift. In other words, don't go tattooing your subtype onto your arm. It's a provisional scheme. Another big caveat, these studies have really big limits in scope. They both focused on children. In the 2025 study, it was aged 4 to 18, and the 2023 study was mostly in kids and young adults. It was 5 to 30 being the oldest person, but the data skewed much younger. This means autistic adults were not part of the equation. We have no idea if these subtypes apply to adults, especially to those adults who might have been late diagnosed or who grew up without today's level of awareness. The life trajectory of an autistic person can change how traits manifest too. Some adults learn camouflaging strategies, some gain or lose co-occurring conditions over time. And it's possible that if you ran the same analysis on a bunch of 40-year-old autistic people, you'd get a completely different clustering, or at least a different balance of the 4. Likewise, the 2025 study was heavily US-based and frankly not very diverse. Large genetic studies often overrepresent families of European ancestry who have the resources and willingness to join a project like this. Autism's expression and detection, of course, can be influenced by cultural and socioeconomic factors, not to mention system bias in diagnosis. I present all the underdiagnosis in girls and minorities as evidence. So these 4 subtypes might reflect the most common autism presentations in mostly white American kids whose parents signed up for an Autism Speaks adjacent research study, but not the 4 subtypes for humanity at large. And as with everything, results can depend on who is studied and how. Future research will need to see if the same clusters pop up in more diverse populations or in other countries. It's encouraging that the team cross-validated their findings in a second dataset, the Simons Simplex collection, and found the same 4 groups. But again, the SSC is a similar demographic. We don't know, for example, if autistic people in other ethnic groups or cultures would cluster the same way. I don't suspect that they do. But we don't know. Also, this is really crucial. These studies looked at certain data but ignored other dimensions that many autistic people consider important. Neither of these studies incorporate any first-hand lived experience of autistic people in defining what meaningful subtypes might be. The clusters were derived entirely from clinical and parent-reported metrics. These things are the usual yardsticks in autism research, but they are going to miss things like sensory profiles, burnout patterns, or mental health nuances that autistic adults know all about, and neurotypical researchers don't. So, while the biology is interesting, the categories might not capture what autistic people themselves find most relevant about the differences. We should be wary of turning these subtypes into new labels that could be used to exclude people from services. For instance, if someone's dubbed moderate challenges subtype on some future diagnostic paperwork, does that mean that they won't qualify for certain supports because they're expected to have milder needs? We shouldn't go there because the science isn't there, and people will always vary. In fact, I can actually see right now, little hot take for you, a mic hot take, especially for you. I can see now, right? I'm probably gonna have to make a reaction video at some point, because pseudoscience peddlers, they're going to be getting ready to seize on this idea of new subtypes, right? They're going to be hawking new bogus therapies like find out your child's autism type with this questionnaire now and get a custom supplement regimen. Don't buy it, literally or figuratively. In summary, what do these studies not mean? They don't mean that we can diagnose autism subtypes in the doctor's office. They don't mean autism has been solved or that these are only 4 types to exist. And they definitely don't mean that you should start sorting autistic people into different castes with fixed destinies. It's the whole kind of like level 1 to level 3 thing all over again. We're at the beginning of a new type of AI, machine-led research, not at the end. And that bit's kind of cool. That's kind of fascinating. If you want to see more, and of course you do because you're awesome, please stim the subscribe button below and click the like to tell the YouTube machine learning algorithm that this was a good video and more people should see it. Last week I posted my longest ever video on the subject of sex and relationships, and it's well worth a watch, even for the first few minutes where I go diving with... yeah, give it a click. I've also pinned a bad science playlist which has more science reactions, and there's even more on my Patreon page for members who support my work. That's where you'll find exclusive content, including behind the scenes content. You get to have a say in my upcoming videos. In fact, you've recently chosen How to Keep House While Drowning as the next Tea and Tales book club giveaway. And of course, the 24/7 neuroaffirming Scratching Post Discord community. Give the last video a click. You know you want to. Bye for now.